What really happens when you feed too many crickets to a tree frog? How do you feed White's tree frogs and green and golden bell frogs in captivity without crickets? In today's episode, we're starting with those two questions because improper diets are one of the biggest hidden problems in frog care, and they lead to so many things like stress, malnutrition, gut impaction, and even long-term behavioral issues. It happens to even the most experienced of keepers. We mean the most for our animals, and yet somehow something that we could never have imagined takes place and affects our beloved frogs and toads. We're going to talk about these struggles with the White's tree frogs and bell frogs in today's episode. Before we dive deeper into this episode, there's one frog who deserves a shout out in his own moment in this episode, and that's Jeremiah, the male White's tree frog. He was once the shyest of all the White's tree frogs I've ever kept, and I've had the privilege to learn more about him as he became the breakout star for the Wild Vivariums episode in Season 5 just last year. He's been thriving, and there's so much good to talk about with this little frog. I can't wait to get deeper into exploring how things are going to go with Jeremiah in the future. I personally believe that this is the year of the bell frog for this specific enclosure. I believe, as we see in this episode, we're going to find out what makes these little frogs come out of their shell, just like what Jeremiah did a season ago. You're looking at one of the first Easter eggs for this episode. And then there's Max, the star of this enclosure, the veteran of the Australian frog's Vivarium, and the frog whose story taught me one of the hardest lessons about long-term care. For over a decade, Max has been a part of the Woods and Forests media community. She's carried this channel at times when nobody else could, for many reasons. But for today, we want to talk about a mistake that cost Max some of her vision. Especially during seasons 4 and 5, Max ate mostly crickets. Not because they were ideal, but because they were the only feeder that worked consistently for this mixed species setup. The bell frogs were able to hunt the crickets, and Max, being a little bit slower, was not able to outcompete them and dominate. Green and golden bell frogs are very fragile and sensitive in captivity, and the slightest bit of uncomfort, they let out a scream and run away, and you might not see them for a long period of time. They're very finicky and very intermediate to keep in captivity. The reliance on crickets had consequences. The imbalance in nutrients, especially the fat content relative to what White's tree frogs should be eating, allowed lipids to accumulate in Max's eye, and over time, those fatty deposits distorted the lens and impaired her vision, leaving with a permanent cloudy eye and reduced ability to track movement on that side. It's a reminder of how even small limitations in captive environment can ripple into a major health challenge, and why her recovery and care plan in this new phase matters so much. Getting back to our Easter egg from the first part of this episode, the grasshoppers. These were heavily studied and researched to make sure that they were high in protein and a much better choice than crickets. Not only were they a good part of the diet for Max, who now had eye issues, they quickly became one of the favorite, if not the favorite prey item of the green and golden bell frogs. They were a lot harder for the White's tree frogs to hunt. However, the bell frogs became very aggressive and they relished the opportunity to hunt the grasshoppers. It really brought them out of their shell and started to get them to interact even more with the environment. It was incredible to get these shots of the bell frogs. Even though this is a prey item that I can afford to give them every so often, semi-occasionally, it wasn't going to be the actual fix for the issue, so that way Max could finally start eating without the fear of her going blind. If we weren't going to use grasshoppers permanently for everyday scenarios for feeding, then we were going to have to get creative and think of something else. Of course, we would still utilize the black soldier flies, the hornworms, and everything else, but we were going to have to go back to the drawing board and try to figure something out. This easily was one of the most stressful situations I've ever had to face with all of my frogs and toads. If I didn't come up with an answer, every tree frog could potentially become blind, and I wasn't going to sit back and let that happen. The worst feeling in the world is that Max, my 12-year-old White's tree frog, who I started this adventure with, was the frog who was going to sound the alarm to try to save the eyesight for all the others. Why would it have to happen, of all of my pets, to Max? That was the worst feeling about all of this. Probably one of the most shocking Easter eggs to anybody who's been following this channel over the years is the re-emergence of Amzie, the southeastern five-lined skink. Yes, she's still alive. She was one of the founding members of the skink dynasty whenever I had a population of southeastern five-lined skinks that had their own enclosure, reproduced for many generations, and were able to live peacefully over the years. At some point during the Wild Vivarium show, I decided to cohabitate the southeastern five-lined skinks, the skink dynasty, with the Australian White's tree frogs, making the first mixed species enclosure, and later on, adding the bell frogs from Josh's frogs. All three of these species were able to cohabitate the 125-gallon that is now the Wall Lizard Republic. However, everybody that lives in here is all living as peaceful as they were during their days in the 125-gallon. Four years later, and 2 enclosures later, and we still have the same peace and tranquility watching all of these frogs and lizards cohabitate. That wasn't the issue. Figuring out how to feed them and making sure that they were eating was the issue, especially when you're dealing with massive enclosures and very stingy White's tree frogs. In hindsight, if the White's tree frogs were by themselves, we might not have this issue, but at the same time, if they were by themselves, we might never have learned this lesson. And then, the worst case scenario could have happened. The White's tree frogs, the bell frogs, and the gray tree frogs all could have developed these eye issues at some point later on. Even though it's one of the most painful and disappointing life lessons that I've had to learn, it's also a learning lesson that I can pass on to you and try to live with and move forward, making sure now that I have the very best that I possibly can for these White's tree frogs, and to make sure that Jeremiah and the bell frogs do not succumb to the same eye issues that happened to Max and Melania, the gray tree frog. As Amzie rests peacefully, it's been one of the most remarkable things to have the opportunity to film her during this episode. There will be periods of time where I won't see her for nearly half the year or longer, and then, just like that, she'll make a reappearance, re-emerging at the surface level, whether she's up basking with the frogs or she's hanging out on the forest floor looking for prey. As I said, I couldn't offer grasshoppers on a regular basis. I just don't think I could get them in that much. The way I was able to come to my conclusion was by taking a deep breath, exhaling, and looking outside. Seeing all the birds on my mom's bird feeder led me to think maybe there's something in captivity we could recreate this with. Just like the birds all waiting for their birdseed, this became the most coveted platform and place where all of the bell frogs and White's tree frogs would hang out. But this smooth surface would not allow the dubio roaches or the hornworms to escape, and even provide a place for them to climb up and get the attention of the frogs. This became the primary way to deliver the prey items for these animals, and not only did it mean I didn't have to rely on crickets, it finally meant that I started to see the bell frogs begin to put on weight. You're looking at the very first night when I installed the frog feeder. Some were a little bit more hesitant to take the trip out into the center of the enclosure completely exposed, so I had to use hornworms to get them to come out of hiding. As I did that, they started to realize that the frog feeder was a billboard advertising their favorite prey items, and now I could finally incorporate the dubio roaches and hornworms, which are two of my most used prey items for my other frogs, toads, and lizards. Now I could rely on them for all of my tree frogs, and we could finally put to rest the possibility of the crickets causing any more frogs to go blind on my watch. As I was reconstructing this enclosure to be more tree frog centric, it meant that we could finally put to rest one of the most stressful times in the entirety of the Wild Vivarium show. With that problem solved, we can embrace the opportunity for a varied diet for these frogs and celebrate one of the biggest wins ever, and even enjoy spending some time with the tree frogs under the stars. That's going to do it for this episode. I hope that you'll continue to watch the Wild Vivarium show unfold for all of our different animals. Please, if you enjoyed this episode, consider liking and subscribing, and share with your friends, so that way we can have more Wild Vivariums content. We'll see you in the next one. Thanks.